midrash that I want to share elaborates this a bit more. So in many ways that Rabbi Akiva says that we need to be, as the verse from Leviticus talks about, part of B'nai Am, or our community, right? Our neighbors. That Ben Azai saying, no, that a greater principle is that we need to be mindful, not just our neighbors, our community, our group, but really the whole human family. That the whole human family is of our concern. And this gets elaborated in another midrash that I want to share, or another rabbinic text from Mishnah Sanhedrin, that famous text about saving a life. That saving a life, if we save one individual life, we are saving an entire world. And if we strike down one individual life, that we are destroying an entire world. This based on another verse from early in Genesis about Cain and Abel, where the rabbis pick up on a particular word usage where it says, the bloods, demei achicha tzoakim, that the bloods of your brother cry out. It doesn't say blood, but bloods. And in a particular interesting wordplay, what is the plural doing in this case? The plural is doing, as this Mishnah teaches, that it is talking about not just Abel's blood, but the blood of all his descendants. And that it's beyond just the one person. And that then comes to teach that our concern, that when we destroy one person, we are destroying a world. If we save and uplift one person, we are uplifting an entire world. This idea of responsibility is just beyond just the one person. But this Mishnah goes on to teach, so related, building on the Ben Azai's teaching just previously, that as it goes, that why a single person was created in the world, to teach that this single life, so that that this idea of upholding a single life or destroying a single life goes back to the fact that the life started according to the teachings of the Torah, the stories of the Torah, from one person. That also, that building on this, that we were all created from a single person for the sake of peace among humankind, because no one could say to another, well, my ancestor is greater than yours. That we all are derived from a single ancestor. So again, building on what came before, that this is the greatest principle of the Torah, because it's not just about our concern is with our particular family, our particular group, our particular community, but all of humankind. That all of humankind, we have obligations and responsibilities towards one another. So I want to hold this as a value, as an important value that informs our work specifically around immigrants and immigration and migrants and refugees, because we're thinking about, when we think about those, we're thinking about, we often get into discussions and thinking about different groups, different nationalities, or different community groups, or one group versus another group. And really what our Jewish values are teaching, what our Jewish texts are teaching, is that our concern, well, yes, we do have concern for our families, for our groups, and for the Jewish people in our case, but we also need to be carrying with us a concern for all of humanity, that people who are potentially even outside our group or others, that those people need to be of our concern as well. And that's where we need to, when we do our work in the world, we need to have a more expansive and universal thinking. So, whoops, it went there for a minute and then went back to think. So I want to hold on to this value and also bring in just thinking about Jewish history as well. And as I say here, Jewish history, mythic and modern, that our texts, our ancient texts, are written in historical fashion, and also are thinking about our contemporary history. So here I have a photo of, this is an actual historical photo that I've been able to dig up. No, just kidding. I don't know if Moses really looked like Charlton Heston, but it's a nice graphic. And this text coming from, or just this phrase, so thinking about work that we do in my congregation at Temple Beth Hatfiloh around supporting immigrants and refugees, we have a resolution at our congregation, which we included these words that thinking through our Torah, from Abraham heeding the call by God to leave the land of his birth, to the story of liberation from Egyptian slavery as told in Exodus, in which we just celebrated at Pesach not too long ago, to the stories of the wanderings of the desert on the way to the promised land, that our Jewish spiritual narrative in the Torah is based on this idea of relocation and migration. That the entire narrative of the Torah, even going back further, we could think about Adam and Eve, or leaving the garden, right, to take on a new life somewhere else. That the entire story, our spiritual narrative, our mythic history, is a story of migration, of leaving one place and trying to find a new home in another place. And that's a very powerful narrative that we just celebrated at Pesach, that we tell time and time again throughout our liturgy and other times. And so it's an important narrative, this idea that our spiritual narrative is a narrative of migration. But it doesn't always, and then that then teaches, as we think about often when it comes to thinking about the Exodus, right? Just a verse, and this is told number of times, 36 times according to some reckoning within our Torah, that based on the story of the Exodus, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, Adonai, am your God. So it's not just the teaching about our concern for all of humanity, that we have common descendants, but based on our experience, our historical experience, our spiritual history, that because we experience this sense of migration, of moving from one place to another, of being a stranger in a place, then therefore, as we get settled, as we create our communities, we need to be concerned with the stranger as well. In this text, in this teaching, this is just one example from Leviticus 19, also from this week's Parsha, but it is repeated time and time again in our sacred text. But we carry with our sacred text, but we also think about our history. So not just mythic history, but contemporary history. And this handsome fellow right there is Solomon Fialkov. Very good looking, I have to say, and strong genes, because he is my great-grandfather, my mother's mother's father, who came here to the United States in 1910 from Eastern Europe, from Russia, through Rotterdam on this ship here, the Oceanic, in 1910. And I know that many of us have stories like this, stories of our own immigration story, taking us from one place to another, where we came from, the old country, our roots. I've actually, during this time of quarantine, I've gotten a bit more interested in this and have been spending a lot of time on ancestry.com doing some research and putting things together, and it's been very interesting. And so coming up with looking at my immigration story and my family history, that I know that many of us within the Jewish community here in the United States have stories that are similar, of ancestors who came from one place to another, either escaping oppression or seeking a new life, or both at the same time, that it was part and parcel. So this is but one example, one of my ancestors. But we would be remiss, I think, if we just stopped with our own immigration stories and our own Jewish immigration story, but to put it in the context of the immigration history within the United States and where the Jewish community falls in that. And, 14 years after Solomon stepped off the boat in New York, the United States passed the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration to the United States, cutting off immigration completely from Asia, and also instilling quotas for immigration from other countries. And this is an important piece of our history, not just United States history, but specifically Jewish American history, in terms of thinking about this and our place within the country, that I think informs our then approaches to immigration today. So the Johnson-Reed Act, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but just to point out one or two things. And if you see on this chart that I'm sharing, this is a rough graph of immigration to the United States over the decades, from where different people were coming from, and where we're looking at is marked by those black bars in the middle. The Johnson-Reed Act, which severely limited immigration to the United States, came in about 1924. As I mentioned, that bar on the right. Part of the thinking around the quotas, or what was, I'm sure, very thoughtfully done by its proponents, but yet also very limiting, is that the quotas were based not on the most recent census of the United States, but were based on the census of 1890. And that was done deliberately, because we can see that a wave of immigration in the early 1900s, between 1890 and 1920, and we can see within the Jewish story that much of early Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe took place during this time. So by setting the quotas prior to 1920 to 1890, prior to that wave of immigration, we see that there's a conscious effort to exclude specifically Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and also others, quote unquote, undesirables, right? People who didn't want to be included. And it was effective, because as you see, it severely cut off Jewish immigration or to the U.S. In terms of, if we look at the numbers from 1921, we just go back for a sec, from about 120,000 down to 10,000 prior, in the years immediately before the Johnson-Reed Act and immediately following. So this is part of our immigration story within that. And so if we go just forward, I mean, you can, if we look at some of these, here's Calvin Coolidge signing the Johnson-Reed Act. These quotas would stay in place until the 1960s. And reading some of the texts, I don't have a lot of time to do it today, but we could, but if you read some of these words that were directed towards Jews, it's quite astounding and shocking. Things like infected with disease, or people who are evasive, dishonest, or incapable of appreciating any responsibility, uneducated, right? Carriers of smallpox, and especially as we're living in a time of pandemic, to read these words of Polish Jews in this example, in this quote right here, having to do with that this is part of what's directed towards those that are undesirables, is truly shocking and compelling. So, and again, I'm going to remind, if people have questions, they can type them into the box, but I'll go, I know we're trying to keep this down, so I'll go a little quickly, but if we want to move forward. And then we see the effects of this 15 years after the Johnson-Reed Act. For example, as we know, the story of Jewry in Europe and the Holocaust, and just as an example, the story of the St. Louis in 1939, 15 years later, where a ship full of Jewish refugees from Europe first tried to make land in Cuba, and then turned away at by the United States. Again, these quotas are in place. Visas are hard to come by, and so this ship of Jewish refugees sent back to Europe to face the Holocaust. Many who got out in other ways, but still others who perished. And in thinking of this too, especially as where we're sitting in our, as Jews here in the United States, but in Washington State, a part of this history is so compelling because this gentleman right here is Albert Johnson, Representative Albert Johnson of the Johnson-Reed Act, one of the sponsors in the House of Representatives of this extremely restrictive xenophobic legislation. Albert Johnson represented the 3rd District of the state of Washington. And at that time, in 1924, the 3rd District of the state of Washington included Olympia, where I sit now. So he represented, now we have 10 congressional districts, then there were 5 in the state of Washington. Albert Johnson was from the state, he was from Hoquiam in Grays Harbor. He's actually buried there, and but represented where I am right now in Congress as a proponent of this legislation. So I think very, very powerful in terms of thinking about the Washington Jewish community as well. a lot of this history, this mythic history and the actual history and the values that we carry moved my congregation to lean into immigrant justice work. And we are currently a sanctuary congregation where in September of 2019, we welcomed in a family, a mother and child from Guatemala who were seeking asylum here in the United States and facing deportation. And we've welcomed them into sanctuary as a means of furthering this act. Sanctuary being an opportunity or an action that faith communities have at our disposal because we are considered sensitive locations, in which the understanding is that ICE policy is not to conduct enforcement in sensitive locations, that we can both provide support for somebody seeking asylum by providing a place for them to live and to be, removed from threat of enforcement, and also by doing so, also hopefully raise the issues of immigrant justice that we face in the United States. So this is an action that we as a congregation in Olympia are doing in support of the larger, and I know that over the course of this week, we'll be learning about many more actions that we can take on behalf of immigrants at this time. So I also just wanted to add just a few more, just quickly, values that I see going back to Jewish values that are especially at this time that we can do, aside from this general concern that we need to have not just beyond ourselves, but with whole human family. This idea of accompaniment, that part of what we can do with others in terms of welcoming guests, that value of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming in guests. This wonderful midrash about Abraham, our ancestor, our spiritual ancestor, who, as we see in commentaries and literature, is seen as the paradigm of the one who welcomes guests. And this idea that Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Eshel, but as this midrash teaches, it wasn't talking about a tree, it was talking about an inn, based on a nice wordplay where Eshel, the word for tree, or tamarisk, actually represents an acronym for achila, shtia, and levaya, eating, drinking, and accompaniment. And part of what we can provide for our guests is not just food and drink or their basic needs, but accompaniment, about being with somebody in their journey. And then just quickly, saving a life. We know at this time pikuach nefesh is a high value in Jewish tradition. That going out of our way to even violate Shabbat or other ritual practices in order to save a life, and to just bring to bear in this case that saving a life, in many instances and many examples that we see in rabbinic literature, is not just about saving your life, but saving the life of another. So what could we do to save the life of another? And part of what goes into that is who is our concern. And as I see in our tradition, that our concern needs to be not just with our own self or our own group, but really everyone else. And that brings us to the last piece right here, which I think part of our Jewish values is equality. We talk about the ger, the stranger in our midst, and Leviticus goes on to teach mishpat echad yihiyeh lachem, that you shall have one law, one standard, kager ke'ezrach, that the stranger and the citizen alike should be treated equally. And that thinking about those who are citizens or visitors or guests or immigrants, then we need to treat them equally. So our concern needs to be not just in terms of saving a life, welcoming guests, based on our spiritual history and our mythic history, that we as a Jewish community find compelled to lean into this work of immigrant justice, and based on our values, based on our history, and the stories that we tell, stories of our own families and stories of our people. So, wow, this is a lot. I'm sorry. Sorry, no, and Max, I think you had a question, but sorry if I kept going on. But,
I did, but we are short on time, so
no, okay, sorry.
To not ask, but rather, hopefully we can get it in the follow-up. So I wanted to share with folks. First of all, thank you so much, Rabbi Seth, for that grounding and teaching. I didn't go to shul virtually or in person this last weekend, but now I feel like I did need to because we so I wanted to let folks know that we are recording this webinar, and this webinar and all webinars this week will be posted on the Jewish Federation's website. In addition, we'll be filling that landing page with resources and with advocacy, asks, and action. So one of the pieces Rabbi Seth is if folks are interested in learning more about having their congregation potentially become part of the sanctuary movement, I'll reach out to you and maybe we can put some resources on there for folks to find that. So when this webinar closes, there'll be a brief survey that'll pop up in everyone's window. If you would take 60 seconds to complete that survey and let us know about how this experience was for you and how we can make it better, we would be very appreciative of that. Again, keep an eye out for an email from us with resources and with recording and just a general thank you. This is also being posted via Facebook Live. Some of you may be watching on Facebook. Some of you may be watching on Zoom. And the event is on our Facebook page. So we'd be grateful if you'd share that with friends or family or neighbors or others who you think might be interested. Tomorrow, we'll continue our programming with Tamid Gilden, who's a Senior Policy Associate for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And she'll be talking to us about what the picture is looking like for immigrants and refugees across the country, what is on the table for Congress, and what we can do to help and be a part of that action. And just want to say lastly, thank you so much again to all of our co-sponsors, to Rabbi Seth for your great talk and learning and presentation, and thanks to each of you for tuning in. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's program. Thanks so much. Enjoy the sunshine.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Max, for everything.